This tutorial is for 5th grade, Module 5, Lesson 11. In this lesson, we will be finding area of rectangles when both sides are fractional units. The directions say to draw the rectangle and our tiling, write the dimensions and the units you counted in the blanks. By tiling, that just means we're drawing the squares that make up the rectangle. So rectangle A is 4.5 units long by 2.5 units wide. I'm going to start by showing the dimensions at the top and the side of the rectangle. So we know it's 4 1/2 units long. And I'm separating those measurements just like I would if I were doing a regular area model of multiplication. The width is 2.5 units wide. So I'll show that along the side. So we have 2 1/2. Now I'm going to draw the rectangles in to represent each of these measurements. So I'm going to show the 1/2 going down the side first, and then the rest I'll divide into the 4 whole units. So I'll divide this into 4. So we have 4 whole units and then a half. For the width, I'm going to divide the very bottom into a half strip as well, and then I'll divide the rest into the 2 whole units. So I have 2 units and a half. Now we have to figure out the size of each of these pieces. Let's start with our whole numbers. This rectangle here would be a 2 by 4 rectangle. Its width is 2, its length is 4. So altogether we have 8 units that make up that rectangle. This rectangle on the side is a 2 unit by 1/2 unit rectangle. Another way to look at that is 2 rows of 1/2. So I have 1/2 and 1/2. There's my 2 rows of 1/2. Along the bottom, I have this rectangle, which is 4 units by 1/2 unit. Another way to look at that is 4 copies of 1/2. So each of these pieces is 1/2. I have 4 copies of 1/2. Now let's look at this little rectangle in the corner. Its dimensions are 1/2 times 1/2. 1/2 times 1/2. Well, 1/2 times 1/2 is 1/4. So that's the size of that piece. Now let's combine all of these for our final answer. Well, we have 8 whole units, and then let's count our halves. I have 4 halves that run along the bottom and 2 halves along the side. That's a total of 6 halves. And I also have the 1/4 in the corner. Let's look at that 6 halves. Well, 6 halves is the same thing as 3 wholes. So I'm going to change my 6 halves into 3 wholes. Now I can add 8 plus 3 is 11, plus 1/4 is 11 1/4. So the area of this rectangle is 11 1/4 squared units. Let's take a look at another example. This rectangle is 3 3/4 units long and 1 3/4 units wide. So I'll do the same thing. I'm going to show 3 3/4 units across the top. So I'll draw my 3/4 and then I'll break the rest into 3 wholes. And it's 1 3/4 units along the side. So I'll show the 3/4 along the bottom, and then I have the 1 whole or 1 row to represent that 1 whole. Now let's figure out the size of each piece. So again, we'll start with the whole numbers. So this rectangle here is a 1 by 3 rectangle, so that's 3 wholes. This piece is 1 whole times 3/4. 1 whole times 3/4 would be 3/4. This rectangle would be 3 copies of 3/4, or 3 times 3/4. So here's my 3 copies of 3/4. And then I have the little rectangle in the corner. Its dimensions are 3/4 by 3/4. Another way to look at that is 3/4 times 3/4, which equals 9/16. So this piece is 9/16. Now let's combine all of these. I have the 3 holes. Now I'm going to count my 3/4. I have 4 sections of 3/4. That would be the same as 12/4. And then I have the 9/16 in the corner. Let's look at the 12/4. That's the same thing as 3 holes. So we'll change that to 3 holes. 3 plus 3 is 6, plus 9/16 is 6 and 9/16. So the area is 6 and 9/16 square units. Rectangle C is 1 1/2 units long by 1 1/8 units wide. So I'll show that at the top. So this is my 1 whole and my 1/2. And I'll divide that out. And the side is 1 1/8. So I'll draw a smaller piece to show my 1/8, and this piece again represents the 1 whole. Now let's figure out the dimensions of each of these pieces. So this rectangle is a 1 by 1 rectangle. 1 times 1 is 1. The next rectangle is a 1 by 1/2. 1 times 1/2 is 1/2. This piece is a 1 times 1/8. 1 times 1/8 is 1/8. And my piece in the corner is 1/8 times 1/2. So 1/8 times 1/2 is 1/16. So that piece is 1/16. Now let's add all of our pieces together. I have 1 whole plus 1/2 plus 1/8 plus 1/16. Now obviously we can't add these fractions because they don't have the same denominator, so we're going to have to change them over. I know I can change halves and eighths into 16. So if I think of 1/2 and 16ths, 1/2 is the same thing as 8/16. Now let's change our eighths into 16ths. If I take 8 times 2, that would give me a denominator of 16, which means I need to take my numerator times 2 as well. So that would be 2/16. And then I can just keep this as 1/16. Now I'm adding 1 plus 8/16 plus 2/16 plus 1/16. Well, 8 and 2 is 10 plus 1 is 11. So my final answer is 1 11/16. So the area is 1 11/16 square units. Let's look at one more question. Rectangle D is 3/4 units long and 1/2 units wide. So I'll show that at the top. It's 3/4 units long and 1/2 unit wide. Now since both of these are less than 1 full unit, there's no reason to divide this rectangle into smaller pieces. In order to find the area, I would take 1/2 times 3/4. So 1/2 times 3/4 would equal 3/8. So I have 1/2 times 3/4. So the area of this rectangle would be 3/8 units squared. So you can see how using the area model of multiplication helps with fractions as well.